Chaos Gaming here, coming at you with another video. So obviously this is a live stream, so what we are kind of aiming for today is a little bit more Dungeons and Dragons content. My goals here today are to basically run you through what would pretty much be your session zero notes, kind of formatting, what to go over, things to that effect. And we're basically going to be just kind of running through my own notes and sort of making sure you guys can kind of get started as a game, as a group. For anybody who joins, feel free to inform me on sound quality, things like that. I've got some royalty-free music playing by Relaxation Harmony. So thank you very much for that contribution. Uh, so, what are we going to gain out of today? So you're going to learn, hopefully, how to generally format your session zero notes, how to communicate your session zero notes to your players in the moment, and what you can and probably shouldn't do during your sessions. So we'll go ahead and get rolling here with, I'll go ahead and pull this up on my own, and okay, so my outlining is pretty terrible because the Google Drive outline feature is pretty mediocre. But what I effectively have here is my list of house rules, which in this case are many. We'll kind of put a pin in that though and talk about that later. But some of the more important aspects of this whole project are going to be expectations. Not just expectations that I have for the players, but the goals that I have set as a GM and kind of what my hopes are there. On top of that, I have pretty explicit boundaries set, and then some less obvious boundaries kind of left open to players' interpretation. It's really important to remember that your session zero is a conversation. It is not necessarily gameplay unless you're just absolutely done with everything. And in addition to that, I have some character creation notes for when we actually start rolling stats and making characters. Because unlike what I've done in the past, which has included basically just allowing character creation off-site, out of game, we're going to be changing it up a little bit for the beginning of this campaign. We're going to be making all of our characters in the moment. And this will hopefully give me an opportunity to answer questions or anything going on there. So in terms of just raw formatting here, you can see that I have bold titles, pretty obvious, easy to see stuff. Bam, gameplay boundaries, nice little space there. Bullet points as needed. You can probably tell too that I have a lot of things highlighted. The reason I have them highlighted is to emphasize what I really need to say, what I need to say. It's like syllabus day in the class, when your players are going to get pretty irritable if you just sit there and read off a list of things. So it's good to just kind of read and kind of just ingest the note that you put, and then just make sure if you say nothing else, you say whatever you highlighted, whatever you managed to highlight in your note. A good example being, one of my first house rules is, I have a homebrew Pathfinder version of the Solarian class in Vest Grace. So with that in mind, easy peasy. Now, if I sit there and I read, certain elements of Starfinder will be available for play in this Pathfinder campaign, including the Solarian class in Vest Grace, with some alterations. Not really, it's very robotic, and again, you don't want to be the teacher sitting at the front of the classroom reading the syllabus word for word. Of course, you know how to read, your players know how to read. It's really speaking on these matters and not simply giving these notes to your players is sort of where the conversation aspect comes in. You can pause, you can stop, and you can see if anybody has questions, um, and you can kind of just create the dialogue from there. So what I'm gonna do, for your viewing entertainment, is kind of take my own notes and my own boundaries and expectations and things like that, and kind of give you potentially a jumping off point for you to maybe include in your own notes once that conversation starts. So what I'm not going to do is begin that process with house rules, because house rules are always game specific, and they're designed to modify the content to create the gameplay environment that you're trying to create. So we're gonna get into that later, because it's a lot more specific and a lot less general and maybe useful to you specifically. Um, and it's also probably not great advice to show you a two, almost 3 pages of house rules out of the gate, because you have to understand that the table that I play with is very familiar with my style. Um, we've had all kinds of conversations prior to this talking about what their characters could be and what the setting is like. I have an entire Discord server where I've been putting lore for months. So with that context in mind, it is definitely worth considering that for your you know for your needs. So let's kind of get into this, right? So expectations, GM expectations. So this is going to be effectively what I need from my players, regardless of how familiar I am with my players, regardless of how familiar they are with me. It's always good to re-emphasize what you need from the table. Some people have a lot more pet peeves. Some people have fewer pet peeves. It is it's generally my style to give players the benefit of being adults with their own agency. So my first sentence opens with, and I might read this verbatim, so I should probably highlight it. I'm not the type to stop you from getting up, being distracted, having quiet conversations, especially when circumstances make your participation somewhat mute. But I value my players' experience and will have a problem with overly distracting behavior that takes attention away from other players. So, what I'm effectively trying to communicate here, and I think that's why I highlighted this bottom pit here, is I don't expect your constant captivation. I think that's a very unrealistic expectation as a GM. But I do expect respect for those who are captivated in the moment, because I do have to acknowledge that there are players who are going to be invested in what's going on in the moment, and it's really important that the other players at your table, who aren't necessarily all there all the time, which is going to inevitably happen, that they are not sabotaging the experience for those players. And I'm checking chat here occasionally because I realize my formatting's not great, and I can only really see chat information on the corner of the screen with the Twitch stream pulled up. So if I'm pulling that up occasionally, that's why. Also, please don't get offended if I don't respond immediately to your messages, because, again, I have to pull up the screen. So, with that in mind, we'll keep kind of pressing on. Next bullet point here, and I quote that, "There's nothing I can do in this scenario," something a player might say to me, "is not a complaint. I'll have a good response prepared for you, because I don't know your character like you do." Now, what does that mean? That means that I do not put the responsibility on myself to have an action, to have something to say, anything sort of action-oriented revolving around your character. I am not the arbiter of those choices. As the player, that is their responsibility to have something prepared to do, have something prepared to say. Even if you're not a great role player, just having actions, being able to clarify your actions, is something I'm gonna have a really hard time dealing with on a complaint basis, because it is my opinion that there's almost always something someone can contribute. Even in a 5e setting, there's always the help action. There's always, dodge. There's always usually some kind of opportunity to figure out, okay, what can I do to apply my skills, to a situation. And sometimes your skills aren't oriented towards a situation at all, and that's all right too, because the drama and the fun of the game sometimes is rooted in failure and struggle, and you're not going to have an easy time with everything. And sometimes it can be fun to say, well, I want to shoot my shot with this. It's like, well, dang, I didn't roll real great, but let's see where this goes. The point is that the players need to take time to consider that maybe there was something they could have done, they just didn't think about it in the moment. Because again, it's not a complaint that I can address effectively, unfortunately. And I'm reading Glorious Zote's note now. Remember, be bold, do what your character would do, even if it looks risky. Trust me, you'll regret not doing it later. And that is an absolute fact. I absolutely agree with that 100%. But that is absolutely an expectation that I have as a game master, so I will clarify that to my players. Just do something. Doesn't have to be, doesn't have to be super special. Just do something. My next note here is a very pet peeve oriented note in terms of my expectations. Describe your action, and I'll tell you what roll to make. This is only because I have some players who I've played with or run games for, who like to say, I roll Arcana, and then they roll their dice, and I'm thinking in my head, man, you should not have rolled Arcana. Like, you probably should have rolled Planes for that, or Geography, or maybe I wouldn't have even made you make a roll. Thankfully, Pathfinder has the take 10 mechanic, which, generally can kind of control a situation like that, where they say, hey, can I take 10 on an Arcana check to do this? And I can say, oh, well, no, but you can roll for Planes if you want, or take 10 for Planes if you want. So Pathfinder kind of gives me some breathing room there, which is really nice. But huge pet peeve of mine, so I include that. As a GM, do be sure to include your pet peeves in your list of expectations, because if you don't, and your players aren't aware of it, or you don't have it on paper somewhere, you're going to be punished for it later when you're like, hey guys, I really don't like it when you do that. And then they're like, oh, well, you never said anything about it before, da-da-da. Like, whatever. Another one that might be a little controversial for some GMs, but not others. Again, this is kind of a more personal experience here. I'll check my notes real fast. Okay. Sorry, I kind of lost my track reading. I'm running the Pathfinder RPG, and so what I generally get with players who favor Pathfinder and the Pathfinder rule set, understandably so, is that there are so many damn rules. There's so many rules. You have to know. You have to know in order to kind of run the game properly or correctly. A lot of times I find myself in situations where I learn what a rule is and I say, I don't like that rule, period. And that's why I have highlighted here, please don't be a stinky rules lawyer, because I just might throw you a bone that Paizo didn't. The reason I say that is because sometimes I like what Paizo put on paper and sometimes I don't. This goes for me as a game master when I'm planning encounters and trying to make things more interesting. But this also can go for the player on many instances. I have found myself changing a rule to the benefit of a player because I just didn't like the way the rules worked. Or the highlighted in orange here, rule of cool. I believe in the rule of cool 100%. Even in a campaign like this one, which we'll get into more details on later, because it's going to be a lot more post-apocalypse survival, not hyper-realism, but, with more realism aspects included. I definitely want players to have the ability to allow me to help them if Paizo isn't really playing the game that, I want to run. And at the end of the day, GMs, you're the guys running the game. Like, you're the guys, gals, them's running the game. So, you know, you gotta kind of flex a little bit sometimes. I remember an occurrence where one of my players, I literally had to hit him with the Judge Dredd, like, I am the law. Just because it was kind of a little bit of back and forth with the rules. And I just said, I basically said, I don't care what the rules are. This is my rule. And that's kind of your position as the GM. Just remember when, and I have it highlighted in red because it's so important, don't be a jerk about changing rules. Don't change rules out of spite. Don't change rules because you find them inconvenient in the moment. The only reason you should ever change a rule, in my opinion, is to make the game more interesting for the players. If the game you're trying to run is less interesting to the players, why the hell are you trying to run it? It doesn't make any sense. I know I'm kind of glued on that point, but it's really important. You're the GM. You're the guy that makes the rules. These guys need to respect the rules. But hopefully you're just changing the rules because you want them to have more fun. It's like being a parent in a really weird kind of way. Another one kind of in the pet peeve space, and I'm actually going to check my notes here. Find rule of cool such a strange phrase for that when it's more a rule of, oh hey, this guy's creative and actually thinks of some effective combination to use in a fight or discussion. Rule of cool feels more like, yeah, so we put a dragon in this post-apocalyptic universe because dragons are cool. Honestly, I think both of those applications are correct. I think one is just from the perspective of a world builder, while the other is just from the perspective of a player. So I think it's really just more about what chair you're sitting in the moment. The general concept of rule of cool I just view as a matter of, hey, this is cool, why don't we do this? But it kind of varies between your level and degree of agency, depending again on where you're sitting at the table. So I agree on both terms. But I mean, that's just my input. But kind of trying my best to move on from there. I know I'm kind of glued to that one a little bit. We'll sip the coffee here and adjust just a pinch. There we go. So now you get my shoulders. Scandalous. Very scandalous. And to the 2-3 viewers I have, if one of those are one of my players, just be careful. Be careful. If I do future videos like this, it might include spoiler content for my actual sessions going forward. So, we'll see how that rolls. And I'm also going to play with the formatting on future videos to make sure I can see chat overlay while I'm doing Windows stuff opened up. So I'll play with that on a later point, but checking periodically seems to be working for me for now. Okay, so moving on to the next note. Okay, so this is me kind of being a little cheeky, but this is another pet peeve of mine, and I'll go ahead and read this one aloud. I'll be the first to acknowledge that shit happens in terms of the party splitting, but I'll go ahead and tell you it saves none of us time to split up for any reason. I won't punish it, but you're all punishing yourselves by splitting up to shop, roleplay, etc. Unless you've got some kind of juicy narrative solo thing. Deal with the devil, referring to a previous encounter of my own where I needed to split for a second. I asked the party to try and avoid splitting up. And the reason why I included this note is, one, because it can be so boring when the party splits up to shop or roleplay and the rest of the party isn't present, and you've got this situation where you've got 5 or your 6 players standing around while your one guy is shopping and he wants to have an in-depth conversation. They wants to have a, conversation with the shopkeep, and you're just trying to, avoid going nuts as you see 5 players sitting there doing nothing. And you really need to ask yourself in those moments as a player, wouldn't it be more fun if all the other players were here participating, etc., or could? Um, maybe everybody wants to, maybe half the party wants to pit stop at the magic shop, but at least the other half can contribute and say something if they all went. If Because at the end of the day, you can't be multiple people at once, so no matter what, somebody's going to be standing around doing nothing. But at least everyone's there, at least everyone can contribute in the moment. So I really don't recommend splitting the party up in a roleplay context. Now, a lot of people refer to like the don't split the party with the dungeon running, and I also, the merits are there for that as well, but it really is an unsung situation where your party is shopping and they're all in a different store each, and it's just madness. It really can just be madness. Of course, there are other ways to shorten up that process, but you just never know when an RP is going to take place, when there's going to be a quest opportunity or whatever, and it's really good to just have everybody on hand for something like that. I also have a note in this note about player versus player combat and what forms might be allowed in the game. But it really, PvP period just isn't recommended in my mind, regardless of the tone, regardless of, really just regardless of what's going on. You really don't, it's hard to benefit from PvP unless you have very restrained, you need all of your players to not have a lot of ego in the moment of a PvP situation. And frankly, I think in terms of that conversation, consent is a big one. Like, hey, do you want to do some PvP? Like, bring yourself out of game for a moment, have the discussion, and then kind of move forward from there. Of course, this can take a lot of forms, and that's why I definitely left the door open to conversation with that one. But at the end of the day, I just don't recommend any of it, sadly. And I got another note here from Glorious. Thank you, by the way, Glorious, for contributing so much. I really appreciate that. It says, I said this before in another guy's stream, but I think this is something where an MMORPG can shine if it has a proper RP community over a TTRPG. The world is alive and allows players to split up or even turn against each other without it feeling like it could damage the entire campaign. Yes, someone just left or turned against your group, so what? Since this is a big and breathing world, they can be replaced easily, and this doesn't make the characters feel cheaper. Split up to shop. Who cares? World's alive and it doesn't strain your RP at all because there's other people to pick up the RP. So I actually agree with that. You're absolutely right. The MMO setting is really convenient for that. Unfortunately, the burden that we are kind of given is trying to make the same things that might work in one medium work in another. And honestly, as I see it, the most convenient way to address that is to keep your party together. Again, and it's just an opportunity. It's like a situation where you can only kind of attend to the keyboard unless you have something to do or say. And it's like nobody wants to play an MMO where, for the vast majority of the time they're not really doing anything, or they're not even at their keyboard because there's nothing to say or do. It's kind of a recipe for distracted gameplay. It's kind of a recipe for disaster. So it's definitely worth noting that difference, and not trying to pretend that an MMO is a tabletop game, especially in the context of role playing, because role playing in an MMO, not to say they're all like this, but role playing is kind of different in terms of the way the gameplay manifests. Actions and choices and conversations are a huge emphasis in tabletops. And while those components obviously are there in an MMO, I think tabletops kind of dwarf the context a little bit there. So it's just worth kind of keeping your medium in mind. But it is absolutely worth noting that, yeah, in some ways it's a lot easier to just split the party, go shopping, reconvene in 5 minutes, but it does not take 5 minutes at a tabletop setting. So don't run your tabletops like an MMO in every sense of the word, because you're going to get hurt for it. Get a sip of water here. We're kind of bouncing between water and coffee here. But we should probably be sticking to water because we're doing a lot of talking. So I will go ahead and go into player expectations. So I have player expectations written here because this is what my players can expect from me as a game master. I put this stuff on paper because I want my players to know and have a physical written assurance that I'm here to help contribute to the experience in certain ways, just like they are. And I have as much responsibility as they do in making sure the experience is a positive one. So we're going to go through those notes as well. Again, these could just be things that you keep in mind as a game master. These might be things that you put forward to your players. Just if you put it on paper, do your best to support it. Don't leave it hanging. And that's all I have to say as we kind of go into these notes. I hope everybody's enjoying syllabus day. This is a good time. Definitely the world will go on without you, however, which is supposed to do, but whether it's good or bad. It's definitely different, much more athletic, and what is general quality. You're not everyone being in the same mindset. But will go on. True. And there's definitely some GMs out there who are of that mind. In the past, I've always I had a mechanic and it was so stupid. So players, if they couldn't attend, caught something called can't succeed the save itis. So you roll a dice, you fail the save, and your form kind of goes into like this like temporal stasis where they can't really be affected in any way. But it was just some weird like plague that afflicted exclusively adventurers, and just occasionally people would just spaz out with it. And that's kind of just how I've always run that. I've gone through 2 campaigns with that, and it kind of worked. It's a meme. It's funny, but it kept players from getting iced, and it was just as easy to say in 2 seconds, oh, I'll catch this guy up on what we missed. Like, okay, cool, very cool, and we're done. Easy peasy, right? So that's kind of the route I've always taken. I might try to switch it up for this campaign, but we'll see, because that's honestly a very effective way of pulling that off. I have observed. So the first thing I say is pretty much my mission statement. My primary objective is to immerse, engage, and entertain the table. The world is as rich as I can manage at this point in my career doing this, and I'll continue to do everything I can to make things in game feel as alive as I possibly can. I prioritize challenges in order to immerse you in a setting that is unforgiving. I'm walking this journey alongside you and will share in both your victories and defeats. So, what does this mean? In essence, it means I'm on the party side. I am always on the party side. But engaging the players means challenging them, in addition to kind of entertaining the table, obviously, with the content I have to bring forward. And I want the players to feel immersed with enough content and resources in order to accomplish a sense of immersion in the kind of little time that we have access to do this. I have calendars built, I have maps done, I have lore, a pretty extensive body of lore that anybody has access to sort of give players the sense that, hey, you know a lot about this world because you live in it. And that has taken, of course, months to accumulate, and that's not to say that any of the players are required, that's not required readers to the players, but it's certainly an option. again, my objective is to immerse, engage, and entertain, but that's not always going to happen. Just reality of the situation. The point is that I'm trying to do that. I am trying to accomplish those things. In addition to that, I will share in all of the party's victories and defeats because I am a part of the party. At the end of the day, my responsibility is, to the party because those are the people that I'm hanging out with right now. And I'm coming to the event, the game, to make sure that everyone else has fun. And of course, I expect the same of players. That's just sort of the social contract of the tabletop world, and that's kind of where I'm going, kind of with that note. Which kind of segues into my next note. I will not retaliate against you as a player for your actions in game. I think this needs to be said for not just for a general note, but a personal one for me. This note is very important to me in particular because there are parts of my very first campaign that really included some retaliatory behavior on my part. Just really intense actions and encounters in game. And I could always feel this like growing sense of frustration that I couldn't really challenge my party and I was not sharing in their victories. I was very frustrated by their victories. And this really wasn't a good position to take, and it was very toxic. And ultimately, I think it was a huge factor in what ended my game. So I always include a note like this, and I'm always very conscientious of making sure my players and I are always on the same team. You should definitely, when running your game, honestly, adopt a very similar stance. And I do. I take that very seriously. In addition to taking things seriously, I will facilitate conflict resolution. This is an if there are like inter-party disputes, if someone takes an issue with me in some way, I assume the responsibility, regardless of the obvious maturity and capacities of my adult table, my table of adults. I will do my best to assume the most mature stance and objective stance that I can. I am happy to mediate for my party with any inter-party conflict. That's something I do because, again, I feel the responsibility of facilitating the game, and if the game is causing genuine strife between players, it's really critical for me to address that. Because again, I feel a sense of responsibility for everyone's fun at the table, and while that should be something everyone feels in some capacity, as the guy running the game, you kind of have to take that on yourself. In my opinion, some people obviously are more they're on the shyer side, or they're not really great at confrontation and conflict, which is also respectable. This is just something that I feel responsible for, so I include it in my notes. I wouldn't demand that of any game master. Again, though, because I'm a fairly mature adult and I can deal with in-game or at the table conflicts with other players. Check my notes real fast. Okay. Another one that's really important to me. I am completely open to feedback of any kind. Again, if my players aren't having fun, that is something that I take very seriously. I want my players to have fun, and if certain things, especially with 2.5 pages of homebrew rules, you really need to be open to feedback, because if you're gonna throw all this stuff in and I mean, I think Matt Colville puts it great, everything you do is in kind of a constant state of beta testing, and if something's not working, your players need to feel like they can tell you it's not working. And then you can kind of have the door open for that discussion, kind of going into it. I also made a commitment to prepare sufficiently for every session, Not to say that I'm gonna do like 8 or 10 or whatever numbers of hours of prep before a session, or maybe I don't need to do 30 minutes of prep before a session, or maybe 30 minutes before the session I need to do some prep. The point is that I'll always kind of address the needs to the best of my ability, because I can't tell the future, to make sure that there's something going on. Even if it's a total derail and that's kind of under the wing, under the plan for you, it's really, really good to just know you've got something under your belt, and not kind of go into something particularly half-cocked. Or if you go into it half-cocked, you have a good idea of kind of how to manage your game in that state of things. So we're going to move on to the kind of the next section with this last note. No, just kidding. I will respect your boundaries as a game master. Boundaries are something we're going to explain in the next section, but I just want to point out, I have this written in bold because it's so important. This is the point where you open the door for your players to state their expectations for you, if they have any beyond what you've already written or stated. I include this because obviously I'm not omniscient. I know my players are going to have stuff for me, maybe expectations for me, that maybe they didn't think about until this point. And I'll keep the door open to that note as we go into the next section of boundaries. But anything, obviously, that they need from me in order to enjoy their experience, I'm going to be there for. So this one is very, very, very critical to your Session Zero experience. If you have nothing else, and this is so important that I pulled up the stream to check the seriousness on my face. If you do nothing else in a Session Zero, get your gameplay boundaries down and out. Do that. If nothing else. We're going to go over these, just because it's so critical to kind of go through it, right? So I have 3 bullets here. I have sexual content, I have violent content, and then I have other trigger-specific content. This stuff is so much more important if you're playing with strangers as well. Obviously, I'm very familiar. I've been friends with years for my players. I still include this note, and I would still recommend it regardless of how well you know your players. So I write, common sense will hopefully prevail in this boundary. We're all adults. I'm an adult, so I'm not necessarily opposed to consensual sexual activity of any kind. It's not the end of the world to me. I put a hard line on anything non-consensual in terms of my game. It's just not something I allow. It's not something I'm going to include. Or, worst case, best case include, worst case fetishize, and I'm just not going to do that. I'm just not going to do that. That is a hard wall for me. Yeah, it's a game stopper. That will stop the game. And I even say that. It's a game stopper, so don't piss off, trigger, or gross out the whole table, please. Again, common sense. Hopefully common sense. But again, if you're at a table with people who you have never met before, and one of them's a weirdo, it could really pay dividends to have a note like this out so you can quote it if they start acting like a weirdo. I listen to a lot of RPG horror stories, and this one can be really critical. I also have one for violent content. I understand that most tabletop games are going to have violence in it. Violent content is really more of a reference to like the vividness and descriptive nature of the breadth and depth of violence in your game. I'm pretty open to respecting boundaries in terms of like violent content, but at standard, especially for this campaign, I think it's dark, it's gritty, it's going and getting it. So I like to keep the violence, vivid and descriptive and bloody and intense. But of course, and I do note that I've crushed a baby skull in a game before. that is a story for another day. But you know, that's sort of, if that informs kind of the grimdark setting to my players that they're going to be walking into. You know, that's kind of the example that I use. And then I also have another note, and I'm going to check my stream real fast. Okay. Oh, God, stop closing tabs. Here we go. So I have a trigger-specific content of any kind. This is very general, but it's pretty much meant to encompass anything that isn't extreme violence or sexual content. An example I use is child abuse, alcohol-related abuse, slavery, torture. These are just things that, again, might be just specific triggers for an individual. And again, especially for a table where you're not very familiar with them, it's good to put this one out there and just make sure that they can reach out to you and say, hey, I don't really care for this specific kind of content. And some of this stuff doesn't have to be open and out there. If it's something specific that, you know, a player just doesn't want to talk about, you can leave the door open for private messages or, you know, private conversations just to say, hey, not a big fan of this. And also, kind of, since we're getting kind of closer to the end here, it's good to have the answers to these sorts of things on this sheet after you go through your session 0, so that you have it on paper again and you can refer to it. And if you accidentally, you know, trigger someone with something that they clarified about, you can hold yourself to account. And if it was not something clarified, you can at least kind of absolve yourself of too much like inner guilt, if they never clarified it, because it just is what it is. If they're triggered by something and you didn't know about it, that's just kind of the reality of your situation, sadly. It's sad that it happens, but it's okay to forgive yourself too, if you do something that they didn't like. But that's boundaries, and even though that was really short, it's so important. Do it. If you do a session 0, even if your session 0 is 15 minutes long and all it includes is these 3 tabs, do it. It doesn't matter. It's so important. But that's really kind of all of your critical content, I would say, for your session 0. Expectations and boundaries are 10,000% the most important thing to address. I have some character creation notes here that aren't particularly interesting, so we'll kind of skip over that. But the next section here is going to be pretty much just for fun. It's going to include all of the homebrew rules, which, if you were here in the beginning, is about 2.5 pages of rules. Not going to read it verbatim because it's syllabus day and I don't want to punish you that way. But we're going to kind of get into that, and maybe if you see some ideas you like, you can kind of import that to your future games. That is my goal with this, and I'm going to drink more water. Check my stream notes. Nope, we're good. And then there was one whole viewer. Hopefully the next 15 minutes we'll bang these out and maybe give you a few cool ideas before we call it a day on the stream. Okay. So like I said at the beginning, I'm going to be including some Starfinder content in my Pathfinder 1E game, the Solarian class, and the Vesk race. So this is all kind of lore-oriented stuff. The current setting that I'm running is kind of in pre-sequel mode to the past 2 games I've run, which have all been in the same setting. The Solarian class is kind of coming to fruition right now in this setting, as well as the kind of gateway to the Vesk race coming into the fold of the traditional fantasy setting that you'll be seeing. To kind of, if I had to put like little hyperlink notes, like keywords, to describe this setting: fantasy, post-apocalyptic, steampunk. Yeah. So that's kind of what we're dealing with here. It's a beast. I mean, we're talking about years of development and whatnot, so it's intense. But we'll get into more of these homebrew rules here. So hit points will cease to increase after 5th level. So first, second, third, fourth, 5th level, you'll get your hit points. You'll get the maximum possible hit point increase. So, a fighter with a D10 plus con, it's always going to be 10 plus con. But after 5th level, players will not get hit point increases at all. This is intended to make the game scarier. And will hopefully be successful without too many violent deaths. Because violent deaths are bad. Healing potions of any kind will always heal for the maximum possible roll. This is to make life a little bit easier and make healing potions a little more reliable. I always get frustrated with healing potions. So, I deal with that by just making them actually really good. I'm also going to give my players another boon. Mind you, all of these rules will apply equally to humanoids across the board. So if I make an NPC that's a 10th level caster, that caster is only going to have the first 5 levels worth of hit points. So everybody's going to be nice and squishy. But it also applies to armor. So all armor will provide a base damage reduction equal to its AC bonus. So if you have a +8 bonus to AC, you also have DR-, which is just DR against... it'd be basically DR8 to physical damage of any kind. In addition, the wearer of the armor can add half her AC bonus to reflex saves. So this is to kind of account for, the fireball, where the big, brute in heavy armor can, eat a fireball because, they're wearing 8 layers of, armor to kind of counteract that. I'm only doing this to kind of make spells a little bit more survivable. Not a lot more survivable, but at least you have significantly better odds in heavy armor of making a reflex save, where you might have had a lot of trouble in the past. I might modify the experience of a heavy armor wearer to the situation. My example is, if the wearer narrowly succeeds a check to avoid falling in a pit of spikes, the succeed condition of the trap save will be met. But the wearer may end the round in the bottom of the pit, protected by the spikes, by the armor's protective plating. So you might still end your turn at the bottom of the pit because you can't leap 15 feet, but you're not going to be impaled on the spikes at the bottom because you were wearing armor. That's sort of the idea there. And hopefully that's just to keep people hopefully a little bit more alive. I also added some encumbrance rules, very similar to the Starfinder role-playing game. So I have armor will no longer penalize movement speed, as it does traditionally in Pathfinder 1e, and that's to account for a weight tab that we can go into down the line. Weight I'm changing again to emulate the Starfinder RPG because I don't love the way it works in Pathfinder. It's a little confusing, so I try to keep it a little simpler here with stuff that's negligible, very light, or bulky. And literally everything's measured in a metric of bulk. So, your weapon might be 1 bulk, your medium armor might be 2 bulk, and then you might have several light items and maybe several negligible items as well. Give it a stretch here. There we go. Okay, so it's basically the way the Starfinder rule works. If you're more than half your maximum possible bulk, which your maximum carrying capacity for for your bulk is your strength statistics. So you can carry 15 bulk with a 15 strength. Moving on. You reduce your movement by 10 feet if you have more than half your maximum possible bulk. If at exactly max, halved, and then beyond that, and you're reduced to 5 feet of movement and stunned. If you're at or above twice your bulk, you're immobile and considered helpless. So, like, if a giant stone crushes you, you are probably at more than twice your bulk, and you're probably gonna die, or you're considered helpless. Another problem with the Pathfinder RPG that I do find that the spell list, while vast, for those who don't know, there are a lot of spells in Pathfinder 1e. The problem is that they're very rigid, and the effects usually really strongly mimic the flavor text of whatever it is. So I'm giving the players the ability to consult with me on modifying spells that make small changes to kind of more closely resemble a player's desirable effect in game. So that might take the form of, a wizard wanting to have a spell that is very similar to, we'll say, Fireball, but, maybe they have the thematic element of being a sort of cold caster or a lightning caster. So what I might say is, okay, well, the Fireball spell does this much damage, and this, has no other effect besides dealing damage. So Fireball's a great example. So I might just give that wizard the ability to take a spell that does the exact same thing Fireball does, but changes the damage type. So that wizard wouldn't necessarily get Fireball. The wizard would get that new modified spell with that particular effect, if that suits their needs a little bit better. I require that they bring me a base spell to kind of base the modification off of. But in addition to that, the way the Pathfinder role-playing game works, divine casters kind of get the short end of the stick. Natural casters kind of get the short end of the stick. So what I'm doing to kind of counterbalance that is making all of the spell lists between divine casters, so that's Inquisitors, Paladins, Clerics, Oracles, and any others I probably missed, interchangeable. So an Inquisitor can take Paladin spells, a Paladin can take Oracle spells, an Oracle can take Cleric spells, etc., vice versa, Same thing from the natural spellcasting spell list for Rangers, Hunters, Druids, and all the others I no doubt missed. I'm going to be watching this mechanic really closely because it is very exploitable. I already recognize that. But hopefully it'll come to some cool kind of magical effects. I've got a very martial party though, so maybe not. But we'll see there. So to kind of account for the kind of post-apocalyptic aspect of the system, I added basically an additional degree of quality. So instead of just having standard and masterwork weapons, I included poor weapons. So poor weapons are basically like decayed, improvised, tribal, like really disposable, crappy weapons. They cannot be enchanted, and when rolling damage, 2 sets of dice are rolled, and the lower result is calculated as damage. So a longsword does a d8. So if you have a poor quality longsword, you would roll 2d8 and take the lower roll on your damage table. That's to kind of account for the poor handling of weapons, and also gives me the ability to lessen the blow of some attacks against the party with enemies that have very poor quality weapons, like goblins, for example, probably aren't going to have the best quality weapons. So if they're hitting with a d6, I'm rolling 2d6 and rolling with the lesser dice on attacks, which can be really good. Standard quality is just standard quality, and there are no effects there. I did buff masterwork quality weapons to actually have the opposite effect, where you roll damage dice and you actually take the higher result. So a longsword, again, you would roll 2d8 and take the higher roll on a masterwork weapon. And a masterwork weapon can be enchanted. But that's vanilla. Check my stream here really fast. 5 minutes, okay. Trying to go through this kind of fast, just because, you know, these are just ideas for homebrew stuff that you might be able to put in your game. So I'm adding an additional component to Resurrection to kind of contribute to the grimdark setting and make Resurrection less frequent. To complete a ritual of any magic that brings someone back to life, a life of comparable strength must be sacrificed. So comparable strength probably means like a humanoid of, you know, within 4 CR of whatever you're trying to resurrect. So if you're level 2, you can kill a peasant and it would work. But if you're level 15, you're going to need something maybe a little bit more prominent and powerful to accomplish that task. The sacrifice must be no more than 1 alignment step from the target of the spell. So if you're targeting a lawful good paladin, you have to sacrifice someone who is either neutral good, lawful good, or lawful neutral. The intention there is to add narrative weight to Resurrection. And I have some riffraff here about, they have to die during the casting of the spell, obviously. But them dying is kind of part of the casting of the spell, and basically just requires like a successful coup de grace action, which is, again, kind of a Pathfinder thing. So it's like you basically have to bind and ritualistically sacrifice someone in order to successfully resurrect someone from the dead. And hopefully that'll add some interesting narrative weight. In addition, for teleportation, the standards of familiarity I found in games that I've played are pretty stretched. It's like, yes, you've been here 3 times, so this is a familiar location to you. I'm not really doing that. I want players to have to be somewhere for weeks or months to really be familiar with a place, because I want teleportation to be riskier, because I want natural travel and teleportation to have pros and cons, gives and takes. Because obviously if you roll a D100 and you have a 50% chance of not going where you meant to go, you may be more likely to just travel there on foot. And I think that was more of the intention of the spell, because I just see it spammed often, which, is what it is. Because I created a calendar, I'm asking all the PCs to give me a date of birth, and I'm actually going to give them a +1 bonus to a stat based on their date. This is just because I like astrology. Yeah, astrology. I like astrology. I'm a Capricorn. Oh, I'm a Cancer. Da da da. I have my own constellations in the world, so they just basically pick a date, and whatever constel they're born under gives them a flat stat bonus. That's just for funsies. And again, immersion, right? Because that's the goal. So I will also be doing critical failures. I still have not worked out exactly how I'm going to do that. But what it does... what this does, in my opinion, is kind of balances out situations where taking 10 or taking 20 just kind of makes sense. Because if you're doing something where you have to roll a dice in the Pathfinder game, it means you're under enough duress to justify possibly being able to fail. So, I would give my players a lot of take 10, take 20s if I didn't feel they were under sufficient duress to roll a dice. But if you're under enough duress to have to roll a dice, it means you have a chance to fail no matter what. And I do like the narrative aspect of critical failures. I don't like making them cruelly punishable. But, it is what it is. And last one here, this is just a quality of life change for those who have played the Pathfinder Kingmaker game. All players can place 5 items in their inventory onto their belt, allowing him to draw these items as a swift action. This kind of gets around the kind of finickiness of trying to dig crap out of your bag like out of your backpack in terms of action economy. Your weapons have to take up a belt slot in order to be drawn as part of a move action in the beginning of combat. But other than that, you can put scrolls, you can put wands, you can put potions, you can just put whatever you want in there. And that will hopefully give my players a few more options in game. Like, maybe I can just whip out this wand real fast and, pop a shot there. That's just kind of a list of homebrew stuff. Significantly less interesting, and I understand that. That was just the last 15 minutes for funsies. But those are all my session 0 notes. Those are this is basically a layout, a template to give you a player the opportunity to maybe learn kind of how to knock this stuff out. I will be posting this probably onto YouTube. It's very long, but maybe something effective, maybe an effective learning tool for you, maybe an effective learning tool for someone else. I hope the content was enjoyable to some extent, as enjoyable as it was educational. It's kind of the goal there. But on that note, thank you to those who tuned in. To my one viewer, stuck around. You're a baller. Thank you. Thank you to Glorious Zote for all of the conversational kind of points that were brought to the table. I really liked all that input. And thank you to anybody else who watches this in the future. But on that note, good day and good night.